The autumn fog of 1941 enveloped the forests near Moscow in a heavy, almost tangible shroud. In this gray, viscous silence where the sound of footsteps was swallowed by fallen leaves, the fate of not just a battle, but of the entire world order was being decided. On one of the forest roads, hidden from prying eyes by thickets, a man stood motionless. His breathing was even, and his gaze was fixed on a spot where, in a few minutes, a motorcade of black armored vehicles was expected to appear. In his hands, he clutched an object capable of stopping the course of history and turning back time with a single movement. This was no ordinary soldier, and this was no random ambush. Behind him stood the might of the secret departments of the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, and in folders marked "Top Secret" was the code name that for decades remained only a shadow in the archives of special services: Operation Cedar. While official Sovinformbureau reports spoke of fierce defensive battles, deep in the rear, within the walls of Moscow offices, a plan was maturing, its audacity bordering on madness. A plan to liquidate the top leadership of Nazi Germany at the peak of their triumphant march to Moscow. We often tend to view history as a clash of vast armies, millions of people, and thousands of tanks. But in October 1941, the fate of humanity could have been decided by one precise action of a few trained professionals. The question was extremely acute. Could the monster be decapitated before its body had yet entered the heart of the capital? And why today, decades later, is so little known about this attempt? As if some invisible hand had painstakingly erased the details from the memory of generations. By mid-autumn of the first year of the war, the situation of the Soviet Union seemed catastrophic. The enemy was at the approaches to Moscow, and at the headquarters of Army Group Center, parade uniforms were already being prepared for a march across Red Square. It was at this moment that the country's top leadership realized that traditional methods of warfare had to be supplemented with something extraordinary, understanding that the elimination of a key enemy figure could cause chaos in the command of enemy troops and disorient millions of invaders. Stalin sanctioned the development of an operation to neutralize Adolf Hitler. Responsibility for carrying out this task fell on the shoulders of the 4th Directorate of the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, headed by Pavel Sudoplatov, a man who already had experience in conducting complex operations abroad. Operation Cedar was not a spontaneous decision. It was a meticulously calculated chess game, where the pieces were the country's best intelligence officers and saboteurs. The main idea was to exploit the moment when the head of Germany, intoxicated by successes on the front, would decide to personally visit the captured territories, or even arrive in the conquered Moscow, as he believed it to be. Intelligence reported that the dictator planned to inspect the positions of his troops and possibly deliver a speech against the backdrop of the Kremlin. This window of opportunity was extremely narrow, but Soviet special services were ready to risk everything to turn the enemy's triumphant visit into his final journey. To implement the plan, an extensive underground network was created in Moscow. If the city were to be abandoned, thousands of trained agents were to remain in the enemy's rear. Their task was not only to conduct guerrilla warfare, but also to prepare specific targets for attack. Key facilities were mined: hotels, theaters, government buildings. One such place was the Moscow Hotel, where the highest echelons of the Reich's general staff were expected to be housed. However, Cedar went beyond mere infrastructure damage. A special operations group was tasked with preparing individual impacts. The training of specialists was conducted in strict secrecy at special bases in the Moscow region. saboteurs studied not only mine explosive work, but also German etiquette, uniform peculiarities, and the psychology of Wehrmacht officers' behavior. They were to become invisible shadows within the enemy's system itself. The most advanced developments of the time were used: silent firearms, portable explosive devices disguised as household items, and instant-acting poisons. Every member of the Cedar group understood that this was a one-way mission. There was no turning back and no room for error. The external layer of conflict in this story ran through logistics and intelligence. To eliminate a target of such a level, one needed to know its route with minute precision. Hitler was pathologically afraid of assassination attempts and constantly changed plans at the last moment. His train, named America, was a veritable fortress on rails, protected by anti-aircraft guns and hundreds of guards from his personal retinue. The Soviet intelligence network in Europe and the occupied territories worked to exhaustion, trying to intercept the train's movement schedules. The difficulty was that even high-ranking Wehrmacht officers often did not know exactly where their leader was at a given moment. The political pressure on intelligence leadership was enormous. On the one hand, the successful neutralization of the Nazi leader could lead to an immediate political crisis within Germany, a struggle for power among Himmler, Göring, and Goebbels, which would inevitably weaken the assault on the front. On the other hand, there was a huge risk. In case of failure, the invaders' wrath could result in even more brutal repressions against the civilian population and a definitive abandonment of any rules of warfare. These were the scales on which millions of lives rested. The internal, personal conflict of the participants in Operation Cedar deserves separate attention. Imagine young people who yesterday were students or workers and today must coldly approach the most guarded man in the world at arm's length. In their diaries and memoirs, which would later become available to researchers, what shines through is not fear of death, but a monstrous responsibility. They understood that not only Stalin, but all of history was watching them. Pavel Sudoplatov, who coordinated the operation, faced a dilemma of a different kind. He knew his people personally, knew their families, and understood that he was sending them to a certain end. His professionalism battled with human compassion, but in the conditions of 1941, there was room only for the iron logic of state interest. The philosophical and ideological conflict of the operation lay in the question of the legitimacy of such actions. In world history, the idea of eliminating a tyrant has always sparked fierce debate. Is the neutralization of one person, even if embodying absolute evil, a morally justified act? The Soviet leadership at that moment was not tormented by ethical doubts. For them, Hitler was not just an enemy, but a mechanism for the destruction of their people. However, there was another, hidden aspect. Moscow feared that after Hitler's departure, more rational politicians would come to power in Germany, who could reach an agreement with the Western Allies, Great Britain and the United States of America, behind the Soviet Union's back. This fear of a separate peace between the West and the new leadership of the Reich became the invisible factor that began to influence the course of Operation Cedar from within. By November 1941, preparations had reached their peak. Sabotage groups had been deployed behind enemy lines, contacts with local liaisons established, and weapons caches checked. Intelligence reports became increasingly specific. The dictator was expected to arrive in the Smolensk region to hold a meeting with the command of Army Group Center before the decisive thrust towards Moscow. Soviet agents had already taken up positions along the railway and in the city itself. Everything was ready to pull the trigger. And this is where that very turning point occurs, which still causes historians to fiercely debate. At the moment when the operation entered its terminal stage, when the lives of the operatives were on the line, an order came from the Kremlin. Cease actions. Roll back the operation. Recall the groups. This decision was a bolt from the blue for those who had spent months preparing for this single moment. The operatives were bewildered. Why, when the target was so close, when the enemy was at the gates, did Moscow decide to leave him alive? The official explanation, which later surfaced in the memoirs of high-ranking officials, stated that the risk of a separate peace between the new German authority and the West outweighed the benefits of neutralizing the Führer. Stalin believed that as long as Hitler was in power, the Allies, Churchill and Roosevelt, would be forced to support the Soviet Union, as Hitler was an absolutely unacceptable figure for them. Other German political figures could have offered the West an alliance against Bolshevism, and then the Soviet Union would have been left alone against the combined might of Europe. This was cold, cynical, but strategically sound logic of the Great Game. However, there was another version. Some researchers believe that intelligence received information about a deep rift within the German general staff. Stalin hoped that internal contradictions within the Reich would themselves lead to its weakening, and direct intervention from Moscow might unite the Germans around the figure of a martyr. Be that as it may, Operation Cedar was put on hold and then completely relegated to the archives. Potential operatives were transferred to other sectors of the front, many of them ending their lives in ordinary battles, never fully knowing the true reasons for the cancellation of their main mission. The climax of this story came not at the moment of an explosion or a shot, but in the silence of offices, where the dictator's pencil crossed out the plans of an entire department. This was a moment of truth for Soviet intelligence. They proved that they could get close to the most protected man in Europe, but they also realized that they were merely instruments in the hands of high politics, where a human life and even the outcome of a single operation could be sacrificed to ghostly fears of the future. The cancellation of Operation Cedar in 1941 is a symbol of how political calculation trumps military expediency. If you were that intelligence officer in the forest near Smolensk in November 1941, with your finger on the detonator pin, knowing that a few hundred meters away, behind armored glass, sat the man responsible for the deaths of millions of your compatriots, how would you react upon receiving the order to retreat? Write in the comments whether you consider Stalin's decision a justified strategic move or a fatal mistake that prolonged the war by 4 long years and cost humanity another 10 million lives. Your opinion is extremely important for understanding how we today evaluate the moral choices of the past. The resonance of this failed operation is felt even today. History does not tolerate the subjunctive mood, but it gives us lessons. One of the main lessons of Operation Cedar is that in modern warfare, special services often play the role of an invisible front, where victories and defeats remain hidden from the public eye. The fact that Hitler remained alive in '41 shaped the reality in which we live now. The war turned into an exhausting battle of resources and the will of entire nations, and not a short surgical strike. This led to colossal destruction, but also to the complete, unconditional defeat of Nazism, which would hardly have been possible with a top-level coup. We see that the value of human life in those years was measured by different categories, but the lessons of Cedar are relevant in the 21st century as well. In a world where threats are becoming increasingly personalized and technology allows reaching any point on the globe, the question of the admissibility and consequences of eliminating key figures remains open. We understand that behind every political decision lies the most complex chessboard, where the pieces are the fates of countries, and the players often see many moves ahead, neglecting obvious solutions for the sake of long-term goals. The forgotten plan, Cedar, reminds us of how many secrets archives still hold. Soviet saboteurs and intelligence officers who prepared for this mission showed unprecedented courage. Their readiness for self-sacrifice was absolute, and although their names are rarely mentioned in history textbooks alongside the names of great commanders, it was they who created that invisible wall against which the enemy's confidence in their impunity was shattered. They showed that even in the darkest hour, when the enemy is at your doorstep, there will always be a force capable of striking back at the very heart of evil. At the end of our narrative, we return again to that cold forest near Moscow. The fog has cleared, and the motorcade of cars has long disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving behind only the bitter smell of gasoline and dust. The man who waited in ambush goes deep into the forest, carrying with him a secret that he will keep until the end of his days. Operation Cedar remained just a line in a secret report, but it forever captured the moment when the course of world history could have changed in a fraction of a second. We are used to thinking that history is written on battlefields, but sometimes it is created in silence, in moments of unhappened events. The tragedy and greatness of 1941 lie not only in what was done, but also in what had to be abandoned for higher goals, which we, perhaps, are only beginning to realize today. The story of Operation Cedar is a story of professionalism, political cynicism, and the fact that behind every great event, there is always the shadow of another, unfulfilled path that could have led us to a completely different world. The memory of such operations is important not for guessing at the past, but for understanding the complexity of the mechanisms of power and intelligence. The next time you study the history of World War II, remember October 1941, not only as the month of heavy fighting for Moscow, but also as a time when, in the forests and on the city streets, invisible fighters awaited their hour, ready to change the world. Their silent feat and their unfulfilled order are as much a part of our common memory as the victory banner over the Reichstag. And perhaps it was this failed abduction or elimination that became the stone which, not falling into the water, allowed the waves of history to flow in their own course to a final and just end. Every time we touch upon such topics, we discover new heroes and new facets of familiar events. The documentary nature of history often turns out to be far more captivating than any fiction. Operation Cedar is a vivid example of how human factors, political intrigues, and professional risk intertwine into a tight knot. This story teaches us to critically look at well-known facts and always search for what remained behind the scenes of official chronicles. For it is there, in the shadow of great events, that the most important answers to questions about how our world is organized and at what cost stability and a peaceful sky overhead are bought, often lie hidden. More than 80 years have passed since those anxious days. Many documents are still classified, and witnesses have passed away, taking their secrets with them. But the echo of Operation Cedar continues to resound within the walls of intelligence academies and in the works of historian researchers. This is a story of how a small group of people almost changed the fate of humanity, and why sometimes the most courageous act is not to shoot, but to follow an order to remain in the shadows. This is the paradox of secret warfare. The most successful operations are those that no one ever learns about, and the most dramatic are those that were cancelled a step away from their goal. Concluding our excursion into the events of 1941, it is worth reflecting once more on the fragility of the historical process. We live in a world that is the result of millions of decisions made and not made. Operation Cedar was one such crossroads. And although Hitler was not neutralized in 41 by the NKVD, the will of the people and the heroism of the army ultimately led to the result we celebrate every year. But the memory of those who prepared this blow in the most difficult hour must live on, reminding us that behind every victory lies an enormous, invisible work of people whose weapon was silence and devotion to duty. We invite you to continue exploring this topic. The history of special services is full of similar plots that are waiting for their time to be told. Subscribe to our channel so as not to miss new investigations and deep dives into the most mysterious pages of our past. For knowledge of history is not just knowledge of dates and names. It is an understanding of how our present was formed and what lessons we must learn to build a worthy future. Until new encounters on the paths of history, which are sometimes far more winding and dangerous than any forest path in foggy Moscow region. It is important to remember that every fact presented in this article is based on currently available archival evidence and memoirs of those involved in these events. Although many details of Operation Cedar still cause controversy, the general outline of events confirms. The Soviet leadership had a real opportunity to eliminate the Reich leadership already at the beginning of the war. Why this chance was not used is a question whose answer we sought today together with you. And let this story serve as a reminder that the truth is often more complex and multifaceted than any myths that grow around the past. In 1941, in Moscow, in one of the buildings on Lubyanka, a duty officer stamped a folder with the Cedar file and locked it in a safe. He did not know then that this folder would become the subject of research almost a century later. He was just doing his job. Like thousands of other people whose names remained unknown, but whose efforts contributed to that great victory, the path to which began, among other things, with such secret plans, daring designs, and difficult decisions. This story is a tribute to their memory, and a reminder to us that there are no forgotten pages in history. There are only pages that we have not yet had time to read to the end. Looking into the past, we often seek simple answers to complex questions. But Operation Cedar shows us that simplicity is an illusion. Behind every historical event lies an abyss of motives, fears, and ambitions. We saw how the fear of a separate peace stopped a hand already raised against the enemy. We saw how the personal heroism of saboteurs became a hostage to grand geopolitics. And this knowledge makes our perception of history more mature and profound. It teaches us not to judge superficially, but to try to understand the context of an era when the very existence of a country and its people was at stake. With this, we conclude the narrative of Operation Cedar, but not the study of the history of World War II. There are many more discoveries ahead, many forgotten names and untold destinies. We will continue our journey through the labyrinths of archives to find for you the most interesting and significant stories that help us better understand who we are and where we came from. Thank you for being with us on this historical journey. Until we meet again on air, where history comes alive in every word. Would you like to learn more about the specific fates of the saboteurs from Pavel Sudoplatov's group? Perhaps you are interested in the technical details of their training or other secret operations of that period? Your participation helps us make our content better and deeper. Don't forget to share this video with friends and discuss it in the comments, for it is in discussions that truth is born and the living memory of the past is preserved. Every message from you is a contribution to preserving our common history. We appreciate your interest and strive to open new horizons of knowledge for you.